Okay, so now I'm pretty much ready to get started, and I'm going to begin to make this armature out of wire. As I mentioned, I'm going to start at the bottom here. I'm going to go through one side, cut off the excess, and then begin the other side. I have a roll of 1/4-inch armature wire. I have the scale that I made on the board here, and I have a pen. And I'm going to keep the wire on the roll as I make it, and I'm going to straighten out a little section of wire as I go. So the ideal armature is as straight as I can have it in between the bends and as clear as I can make it at the bends. So the first thing I'm going to do is look at the first number, which is 1.5, lay down my wire so that the end of the wire is at the 1.5 head measurement, and just make a mark on the wire at my starting point. And then to make a nice tight bend, I'm going to fold the wire all the way in half and then come back to a 90-degree bend. Use this to help straighten it out. Okay, so you can see I've got a pretty nice tight 90-degree angle there. Next, I'm going to take the bottom of that and go to the next number, which is 2.25. Put the bottom of that wire at 2.25 and mark again that starting point. So I have exactly 2.25. Then I'm going to look at the direction of the bend, which is out in the same direction as that first bend. And I'm going to make a pretty clean bend at that point. So it's not a sharp right angle bend. But you can see it's very clear. This bend, pretty straight here. My next bend, I'm going to put that first mark, or not that first mark, the mark I just made for the knee. I'm going to put it on 1 3/4, and then once again mark the starting point. And now from here, this bend is going to have to go back in that direction for the hip. And this is one of the more difficult bends to make because the hip is pretty narrow. So here I want to make sure I'm really tight. And this is going to be beyond a 90-degree bend. So now I have this coming over. And then this is the really kind of the trickiest bend. I'm not super happy with that. I think I can go a little bit tighter. And if you can see, I don't know if you can, there's a little pen mark where my measurement is. I'm going to try and keep that right in the middle of the bend as I tighten it. So you can see I can really tighten it again and again, open it, and the wire will not lose any strength. Okay, that's a little bit better. Okay, now from that point, I'm going to measure a half a head. And this one, I think I may use this pair of pliers for. I prefer not to, but it's such a tight bend that I need. Okay. I'm trying to be very careful not to mar the wire. I don't want it to break there. There. That's going to stay a little more vertical. Next, from that point, I'm going to measure up 2 1/4 heads. I'll lay that on there to 2 1/4. Right there. And then mark. This will be the pit of the neck. And now I'm going to bend it back in that direction, the same direction as the hip. And as I bend it, I'm looking at that mark and making sure it remains right in the middle of the bend. So I bend it all the way across and then come back to get a nice clean angle. Okay. So I'm almost there with this half. So now the trick to this next measurement, because if I try and bend at 5/8 back in that direction, I'm going to start hitting this wire. This bend, instead of bending down, I'm going to bend outward. So the first thing to do is measure it. 5/8. So I've got my measurement, and if I just kind of tried to bend it straight down, I'd be bending it back into this wire. So once again, since it's a narrow measurement, I'm going to use these pliers to hold it in place. And I'm going to bend it forward. Like that. And then I'm going to combine 1 1/4, 1 3/4. If I take all those measurements together, they add up to 3 heads. So I'm just going to go from the shoulder and measure 3 heads, and then cut the wire. Then I can take that measurement and bend it down. And now I have a completed half to the armature. Now, rather than redoing that same process and measuring it against my scale, I'm going to take the wire and copy what I did at first. Meaning I'm going to trace this half so that if there are any discrepancies, and I was relatively careful as I was building it, that all the measurements are right, but they may be like a 1/16 off here or there, or a 32nd off. I would rather have 2 halves that are both a 30-second off in the same spot than have one that's a 30-second off and one that's perfect. Because I can always cheat up or down with the clay, but if the shoulders in the wire and the hips in the wire and the knees in the wire are not level with one another, it's going to be very difficult to get the full value out of the armature. I'll be making lots of corrections with the clay on top of the armature, which is possible but not really ideal. So I lay that down. I'm going to begin just by comparing my wire to that one, make a mark, bend it, straighten it. And then I'm going to compare the angle that I have everything bent to make it as close a match as I can. And that's pretty good. So I want those two angles lined up as well as I can get them. And then transfer my mark at the knee. Bend that. And once again, line them up. Get them as close as I can to matching. And I've made hundreds and hundreds of these over the years. Generally, the first time people make them, they take a long time and they're quite frustrating. But ultimately, even the second one goes much, much quicker than the first one did. But it's well worth your time to be careful when you're making them. And make any corrections as you go. You know, it's never fun to be in the middle of sculpting something that's going really, really well and then suddenly hit your armature and have to decide how you're going to deal with a big piece of wire that's sticking out in the exact spot that you don't want it to. So here, where I bent the hip is just a little bit low. So I'm going to change the position just slightly. I don't know if this is going to show up well on camera, but if you can see, I have a mark here that now is off center because I initially bent it so that mark was centered. It was a little bit short. So I changed the bend to make the mark a little bit off center. Now I'm going to open up the angle like that and recheck where the bend is. And right now, the bend is almost perfectly in line with the previous piece. So that's pretty good. So the main things I'm concerned with as I'm doing this are that the bottom anchor piece lines up, the knee lines up, the hip lines up. As long as all those are in alignment, I should be in pretty good shape. now I've made the bend of the hip, which in general is the toughest one because it's the smallest bend. Seems to line up pretty well. Moving up into the shoulder, and this 1/4-inch wire is generally sold in 10-foot rolls, and one 10-foot roll is about the perfect amount for a 22 to, let's say, 26-inch figure. You shouldn't need more than that until you get into bigger sizes. And I might take this opportunity to talk about wrapping wire. If you've seen these armatures made before, you may have seen a very small gauge, thin wire wrapped around the larger wire. And that's called, surprisingly enough, wrapping wire. And the wrapping wire primarily, perfect, that one's perfect. The wrapping wire is primarily used with water-based clay to prevent the clay from sliding down the wire. This wire is very smooth. Water-based clay does not stick very well at all. And so over time, that water-based clay will start to sag down. There are also artists who will use it on oil-based clay. And that's really much more of a personal preference. The clay that I'm going to be using, this Chavant, it's called Le Beau Touché, is pretty sticky. And I've never had a problem with it sticking to the armature. So I don't use wrapping wire, especially for a small figure like this. And one of the reasons I don't use it for a small figure is because things like the wrists and the ankles are going to be quite small when I'm finished. And if the wire ends up staying perfectly centered in the middle of the form, I can probably get away with using the wrapping wire and having it not interfere. But if I do end up, and there you can see the two halves, I'm just going to adjust that middle section so that these two pieces lie flat against one another. If I do use the wrapping wire and I miscalculate a little bit, and let's say for the sake of argument that the leg, the armature for the leg ends up a little bit too far forward within the mass of the clay, it's feasible that I might start running into that wrapping wire that's sticking out beyond the edge of that core wire. And you can go in and take wire cutters and cut off sections that stick out, but I tend to just like to avoid it altogether on a small piece like this. Okay, so pretty good. Those two pieces line up in the knee, in the hips, and the shoulders, so those two pieces are finished. I have one more section to do, which is going to be this section. Now I could have, if I were thinking ahead a little bit, I could have put 5 heads down on my scale, but instead I only put down 4. If I were using the 4, in other words, if my wire were coming out the back, I could just lay down my wire, mark off 4 heads, and be done with it. But instead, what I'm going to have to do is lay it down to 4, make a mark, and slide it to add one more head, which is not the end of the world. So I have my mark. I'm just going to bend a nice right angle into it, like that. And now is where the X comes in. I'm going to hold up half my armature and just figure out where exactly I want this to go in. You know, I have the option of going all the way to here and having that piece of pipe enter the figure, because if the other half is here, it'll go right into the figure. I can have it just end right at the figure. That's probably, I think, what I'm going to do. So right about there is where I want it to be. So I'm going to hold it just for a moment, mark the length, and then cut off the extra. So you can see this was a 22-inch figure. I probably have 20 inches maybe 22 inches of wire left. You'd always rather have a little extra than run out. So I'm going to take this and just put it back here for the moment. And why don't we take just... So now I have all of my components bent and cut. I've got 2 sections of the figure. I've got the head piece and this piece that is going to anchor onto the pipe. The next thing that I need are these hose clamps. And I've got 4, 2 that are small and 2 that are slightly bigger. The easiest way that I find to put this together is to take this head piece, lay it down onto this piece of pipe. Don't worry too much about keeping it in position. This ultimately will be the correct position. But until I get the hose clamps kind of aligned and tightened up, it's fine to leave it down. So I'll take, you want to make sure that this is nice and tight. So I'm going to turn it. That's pretty good. I already tightened it this way. Make sure this is tight, this is tight. Those really need to be very, very stiff. If this is loose, as you add weight to it, it's going to start to rotate. Then you take your 2 clamps, lay them onto the pipe. I have this socket driver, which looks like a screwdriver, but it's got a little socket in the end that fits perfectly over this little screw head and makes it easier to tighten. You can use a screwdriver, but frequently it'll slide out of the holes as you're tightening. Ultimately, I want this wire to end up on the top of the pipe. But for now, I'm not going to pay much attention to that. I'm just going to lay it into the wire or into the hose clamps like that and begin to tighten the clamp. As I turn the socket driver, the clamp will get smaller and smaller. I'll try and move my hand so it's a little easier to see. And maybe I can turn this so you can see it from the side. And you should see it getting tighter. And I don't want to go too far without doing the other one. You can also put a socket into a drill and use a drill to do this. If you do that, you want to be careful because it'll go so quickly that it'll be easy to pinch your hand. Right now I'm kind of holding it. My thumb is getting pinched a little bit, but because I'm doing it so slowly and manually, I can move before I really get my skin pinched too badly. With a power drill, that can happen pretty quickly. Okay, now they're getting kind of close to really grabbing onto the wire. The wire is still pretty movable, and so this is the point at which I'm going to make my adjustment. So you can see as I turn that to face the camera, you can see there's a little bit of play, moves a little bit, but it's not so tight that I can't adjust it. So now is a good time to orient it the way I want it, which is, as I said, on top, like that. And I always want one clamp as far out as I can get this way and one as far in as I can get. The only issue with this particular setup is I want this clamp either to be completely inside the figure or far enough away from the figure that it doesn't interfere with my sculpting. So if I were to make this the head and the core of the figure, you can see that that clamp right there would be right by the hip and really interfere with it. So I'm going to move it a little further out. Before I finish tightening. And that's probably okay. Right there. And then, again, make sure it's right where I want it. Tighten that one. And then tighten this one. The further away the clamps are from one another, the tighter they'll hold the piece. If the two clamps are right next to one another, that whole piece can pivot because it'll be almost as if it's being held only by one point. And this isn't really ideal, having this clamp in, because as you can see, I can bend it up and it'll start to lift away from that pipe. So I'm going to have to be a little bit more careful when I start positioning the armature with the model. Right now I'm really tightening these clamps down pretty hard. You have to be careful not to go crazy because you can strip the clamp. But these now are really, really nice and tight. Next, I'm going to turn this so you can see it a little bit better. I'm going to take these two pieces of armature, lay them one on top of the other, and take the two smaller clamps and thread them on. You can start either at the leg or up the arm. And I'm just going to slide it down around the bend and onto essentially what will be the torso of the figure. All right, so now I have the two clamps loosely held in the middle. Now I can drop the entire thing over that centerpiece and that's how I can finish tightening everything up. Again, one clamp, I'm going to go as high as I can, which will be up here, and one clamp as low as I can, which is going to be at the bottom. I want to make sure that the hips are aligned and that the shoulders are aligned. But right now, all that's really important is that things aren't overlapping too much, which I feel like they are. I want to get these these pieces, there we go, nice and side by side so I get the full width. Now I'm going to take that clamp, pull it to the top, and just get into a position where I can. And it's moving around a little bit on me, but that's fine until I get my clamp to begin to grab. So when it begins to grab, it'll stay where I leave it, and now I can make my adjustments without constantly holding everything together. You can see it's still pretty loose. I might give it another quarter of a turn to get it where I want it. Now I'm going to make a couple of final adjustments. A couple of things that I'm not happy with. I don't like that this wire is overlapping this pipe. So I'm going to loosen these clamps just enough to allow me to pull everything out a little bit. And that's one of the nice things about the hose clamps. You can get them all tightened up and then end up making a mistake, and all you need to do is loosen them, make your adjustment, and then retighten them. And that, I think, is a huge advantage. There are sculptors who use epoxy for this to put the pieces together. They'll wrap the armature with wrapping wire and then put epoxy over it so it's really solid. And that will make it really, really tight. But if you make any mistake, it's almost impossible to correct. You can't really undo epoxy. Okay, so now I'm going to tighten up this bottom clamp. And this bottom clamp that I have is a little bit oversized. I had one small one, which is good for the top of the armature. This one's a little bit big, and that's why when I tighten it all the way, it's got this flap. And I can either cut it off or I can just bend it in, and it will eventually be completely covered up by the clay. This I'm going to make a little adjustment. You can see the shoulders are slightly out of alignment and the hips are just slightly out of alignment. So I'm going to loosen the armature just a hair, change that alignment, and then retighten. And that's much better. Put that way at the top. And by putting that at the top, when I start opening the arms or raising the shoulders or making any adjustments up there, there's no way that those can pull apart. If this clamp were down lower, as I started moving the armature, this point could start to widen. So it's a good idea to have. And the same thing down at the bottom. You don't want those hips to spread apart because that would defeat the point of having that measured very accurately. Okay, so now that I have everything set, the one thing remaining is going to be to bend the head. So I'm going to go and grab a pair of calipers, and I've actually got 3 different pairs. And I know, based on the measurements that I've written here, that the neck from the suprasternal notch, which is here, to the jawline is a half a head, and obviously the head is 1 head. So I'm going to set my calipers at 1.5, which will give me the neck and the head. And from this point, I want the very top to end here. Generally, I'll go just a tiny bit below that in case the model is either has their hair pulled back, so there's very little on top, or some male models might be bald. I don't want to get that too close to the very top. So I'll bend it over. And that's probably too close for me. Yeah, that's actually hitting. So I'm going to come down a little bit more. So that's pretty good. That gives me, maybe between an eighth and a quarter inch of clearance on top. I'm going to check. These are smaller calipers. They're actually called dividers because they're straight edged as opposed to curved. And I'll explain as I go why you would use one versus the other. I want to make sure I have room for that neck, which I don't. That wire is protruding a little too low. So I'm just going to cut off the bottom. And then put that down. Now I have room for the neck and the head. And there's the completed armature. So we're going to take a short break, and then when we come back, I'm going to have the model set up and go over some procedures such as the correct height of your sculpture stand relative to the model, and I'll talk a little bit about setting up the pose. Today I'm going to begin a course in figure sculpture. I'm going to go into how to make the armature, how to figure out all the different sizes of all the different components of the sculpture. I'm going to explain a little bit about proportional systems. Once we get involved in the sculpting itself, I'm going to talk about issues like rhythm and pose and movement.
A sculptor of international acclaim, David Simon's career has ranged from life-size portraits and figures to massive bronze statues, and holds private workshops abroad and in his Los Angeles studio.
So I'm going to get involved in all of that over the next few sessions as we work on this figure in oil-based clay. So let's get started.